My special guest today is Ian Hatton. Ian, a very, very warm welcome to you. And just to tell you a little bit about Ian, he spent 19 years working in corporate IT, culminating in a leadership role at Microsoft. Since then, he's been working internationally with business leaders from over 60 countries. For the past 3 years, he's derived more than 50% of his income from live online training. So if you think it's not possible, well, Ian's doing it. So please welcome Ian Hatton. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you. Good to see you again.
Thank you. And Ian, incidentally, those 60 countries, you didn't actually have to get on a plane, go to the 60 countries. Maybe you've been to some of them, but most of them you've probably trained from the comfort of your home.
Absolutely. So I probably have gone to about 30 of those 60, but I've had people from, countries like Estonia and Azerbaijan and, all over the place, Central African Republic. And I've got the list. In addition to the ones I've gone face-to-face and a lot of work into Sweden in particular and other parts of Europe. And then a lot of face-to-face work all over Africa and virtual work into Africa as well.
Very exotic. A lot of those places none of us would have even been to or know much about. But I guess the people all work the same. They lead their teams. They want to run profitable businesses. They want to put food on the table, and they want their businesses to continue running.
Yes. So what's fascinating is a lot of the work I've done has been on virtual leadership presented virtually. So a lot of it has been a big global corporate that have decided that the best way for them to function globally is in virtual teams. And so they want not only the official sort of manager or head of every team to be trained, but anybody who's in a senior position who would provide some form of leadership in a virtual team. They want to train up. And this is their global strategy. And they've been doing this for about 5 years. Well, 5 years ago, they still used to present the training face-to-face, which is a bit of an anomaly if you think about it. Yeah. Do face-to-face training on how to be virtual. And then they realized, no, the real value was in demonstrating virtual leadership by having a virtual facilitator do the facilitation of the training.
Yeah, and I guess there's a whole discussion on the profitability of being able to manage teams virtually. But let me ask you specifically, you were a classroom leadership training facilitator before you started delivering online training. So what were the biggest adjustments in becoming a virtual facilitator in front of a computer screen?
So it's really interesting because I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. I mean, my background is IT, not that much in the technical side. I left that many, many years ago. And I thought, well, I'm going to be combining my classroom and my IT, and this is it. And I very quickly realized it's a whole new ballgame. And that my IT background didn't really count for much, because what I really needed was experience in, for example, looking into the camera and keeping stories short and all sorts of stuff. So it was quite a challenge for me. I kind of went through quite a dip in my learning, only to emerge sort of sometime later where I finally felt I'd found my feet and become competent and comfortable in doing it.
And for you, what were those key lessons? What were the things that you had to teach yourself to do in terms of engaging an audience that really made the difference and got you onto the level that you wanted to be?
It's such an interesting topic. We could spend hours talking about this, but for me, some of the big ones were, I'm a storyteller and I tell long stories. And apparently in the virtual world, a story should never be longer than 2 minutes. So, there is engagement. You want some form of active engagement every 4 to 5 minutes. You don't want to just be talking for 20 minutes at a time. People will be on WhatsApp, they'll be on email, they just zone out so quickly online, especially if they can't be seen, especially if their video is off. And so you want some form of interaction, some form of feedback every 4 to 5 minutes, and you probably want to vary what mechanisms you use for that.
So I guess then that the virtual environment is a little bit less forgiving than a classroom environment because you can lose people a lot quicker. Would that?
Basically, the rule of thumb, and it applies to virtual teaming and virtual leadership as well, is most things get exaggerated. So if somebody will zone out in a classroom in 10 or 15 minutes, they'll do it in 4 or 5 minutes in a virtual environment. If you are boring in a classroom, they'll tolerate it. If you're boring in the virtual world, they will clock out. They won't be there anymore. You know, we've got a saying which says, attendance is nothing, participation is everything. And in attendance means absolutely nothing. I have had people log on to a course and then zone out. And on some of the tools like Adobe Connect, you can actually, it puts a little red mark next to them because they're on another app and they're not there. There's no interaction, there's no mouse movement, there's no keyboard, there's nothing happening. And literally reappear an hour later, and then I probe them on it. And what's fascinating when I probe them is, oh no, well, there was a crisis and I had to go and fix it. Nobody, he didn't tell me, he didn't notify me, you know, he just disappeared. Yeah, exactly.
So I want to just talk about Zoom a little bit first, but then maybe move on to chatting about the other online platforms. So we're using Zoom at the moment. Some people call it Zoom, but so Zoom seems to, at this stage, be a bit of a market leader in terms of take-up. There's been a huge increase in users since December. In fact, really since the first quarter of this year, I believe it went up from 10 million to over 200 million users, and it's probably far in excess of that. Why would you say that Zoom has been so popular?
Well, I think I mean, there's a couple of reasons. The one is it's very stable, it performs well. Yes, there were some security issues, but a lot of those are just bad setup, bad management, and they've been rectified immediately. But it's just become so universal. It's, you know, it's like Skype was 5 or 10 years ago. It's basically taken over that position. It's very easy to use. It's nice and flexible. It's got a lot of features which are useful to training and webinars and those kinds of environments, and of course meetings. You know, the ability to see everybody's faces on the same screen, that kind of thing, very, very useful. And it's got some pretty good training features as well. You could do polls, you can do annotations. Not as sophisticated as the very high-end products, but a very, very solid all-rounder.
Okay, so you referred to those other products for video conferencing, but just before we go there, could you give us your interpretation of when you use a video conference and what is that, and when you would use a webinar and what is that?
So it's actually it's a very interesting question, and I think it's one of those things which there's a lot of overlap between what various things are and what they could be and what they could be bringing. So I think, let me start with this. I think one of the things that distinguishes for me a webinar is scalability. Webinars can typically scale to hundreds, if not thousands of people. As a live, I'm talking live now, I'm not even going to go into recorded stuff, but in a live webinar where you are physically hosting it, presenting, whatever, they are immensely scalable. So typically when you're looking for feedback in a webinar, it's going to be an opinion poll. Or maybe if you've got a producer to help you, put your question in the chat box and the producer will scan. But the person who's facilitating cannot monitor every question and every possible scenario. Also, typically in a webinar, especially if it scales again, you're not going to use their microphones. You're only going to limit it to maybe yourself and one other person who can have microphones open, but everybody else is going to be, you know, shut down because it just, the noise would get too much, the interference would get too much.
So you'd recommend, to interrupt you there, Ian, but you would then recommend that anyone running a webinar has a co-host who's assisting them with things like the questions that are coming in and so on and so forth, and that it can be quite difficult to run one of those on your own.
The bigger it is, the more you need help. In fact, a lot of work for the Ken Blanchard companies, and when they sell online training, they sell it with a producer. So the producer is a person who will be there all the time, handling all the technical issues. Even when we talk about virtual teaming, back to my sort of pet topic there, we advise shared leadership in a virtual team, including somebody who plays a role which we call the gatekeeper, which could be the producer. But it's the person who, if somebody's looking for the password, they couldn't find it. Somebody is, having a technical problem, their headset isn't working, or whatever it might be. This gatekeeper come producer handles that, because if you're busy facilitating, you can't interrupt everything to handle every technical problem of every person who's attending. So I would say it's all about scale. Probably 8 or 10 people, you can probably do it as a one-man show. The moment you get more, it needs to be a multi-person show. And big webinars, I would never try and tackle one on my own. I wouldn't even dream of it.
So that really brings us to video conferencing, where you have typically a small audience. Maybe you would have, up to 100 people?
I would even say smaller. I would. So most of the classes I do are between 12 and 16 people. And going even, I did one recently up to 20 people, and it was tricky. It's a crazy, just to go from 16 to 20, and it's a multiplier in terms of complexity. And we had a lot of technical issues that particular day, and it almost got out of hand. And so typically if I'm doing classroom type training, we would have 16. A maximum I ever do in a classroom training is about 25, if it's a proper training. But the moment it goes virtual, if I wanted to go above 16, I would definitely have a co-facilitator or co-producer. But most of the work I do is sort of between 12 and 16.
But this kind of thing, when we're doing a video conference type of environment where you're being interviewed, would you be comfortable with 30 to 60 people? Would that be quite reasonable?
Yeah, I mean, it starts to get to that gray area that is somewhere between a training and a webinar. Yeah. Because you could do an interview as a webinar. And so maybe it's the sort of sweet spot in the middle between the sort of very structured classroom work and this sort of very, very broad, almost broadcast style webinar. Maybe somewhere in the middle. Yeah, and there, comfortably 100 people, sure.
Right. And then other platforms apart from Zoom.
So, when it comes specifically to training facilitation, probably the best I've used is something called Adobe Connect. And it's priced very differently as well. So, just understand Zoom is very accessible. But the moment you're going on a product like Adobe Connect, what it provides, which you don't get with Zoom, is a pre-formatted structure. So rather than me sharing my presentation as a participant that is just then being shared to all the other participants, on Adobe Connect, you preload your presentation. Yes. And it sits in a separate window. And then you've got a window that it's all structured. The whole layout you can configure and structure. So you can have, say, for example, all the chat down the left, the technical chat below that if you need that, then your slides, then below the slides, maybe message boxes that also relate back to the breakout rooms. So when you put people into breakout rooms and they type in there, it'll reappear in the main room when they come back. Yeah. Video, people raising their hands, all of that kind of stuff. You've got space to fit all of that onto a screen. Sometimes even you can put a timer on the screen. So, when people have a break and they come back, there's a timer ticking. They know when the session's going to start. Or if you put them into a breakout group, that timer can appear there as well. So it's a very much more sophisticated training specific platform. Well, they do have webinar versions and meeting versions, but the one I'm familiar with is the training platform. Highly configurable, highly replicatable. So you can, have a very standard layout and training that you run over and over again, and everybody has the same experience every time.
Okay, so there's that platform. There's also GoToMeetings, there's Microsoft Teams, there's Skype.
Right. So the Microsoft Teams environment is primarily a teaming tool. It can be used as a meeting tool. There is even a sort of a webinar scalable version that you can use, but it's its design was created for meetings, so not so much training. So you can share slides, but not quite as slick or quite as many features on that part of it as even Zoom has. And there are add-ins you can do, so it's possible, but I would say in many cases Zoom is just very, very simple to do a lot of sort of training type features online, and Teams is brilliant for meetings. In fact, I've had Teams performing exceptionally well during lockdown, which some of the other platforms have been a bit up and down. Skype is basically the video part of Microsoft Teams that they've now brought in, and it will be phased out. Microsoft plan is to actually phase Skype out and replace it with Teams. GoToMeeting I haven't used much, used it a little bit. I'm very familiar with WebEx. So WebEx, and WebEx again has 3 modules. It has WebEx for meetings, WebEx for webinars, and WebEx for training. And the one I've used there the most is training, a lot of polls, breakout rooms, those sort of features again, quite a rich environment for doing all of that.
And I imagine that you are sometimes, you have to go with what your client is using. So if you're a trainer, it's quite a good idea to familiarize yourself with the various different platforms, so at least you've got a reasonable working knowledge of how they move. But now, you've alluded in earlier on to various forms of engagement. What are your main ways of getting people engaged? Because that's really what this call is all about. How do you engage your audiences?
It's such a good question. Thank you, Paul. So if we look at the most basic ones are the chat box. So asking a question and getting responses in the chat box, very, very basic, very accessible. Just what I personally find is when I'm facilitating, I don't always have time to type in the chat box. Yeah. And so I'll often ask a verbal question and ask for responses in the chat box. Yeah. So chat box is one way of getting engagement and feedback. A second one is you get these sort of mechanisms for doing a reaction to something. So, I mean, a very, very basic one, I'm going to give you a thumbs up, which is going to appear on my background here. And that will disappear after a little while. And so you ask people to give me a thumbs up if we're doing okay, or, whatever. Or if I do a breakout and I get each breakout group to come back and have a presenter present what they came up with in the breakout, I will ask people to applaud that person afterwards. And so they use the reaction button to show applause. I mean, I can do that now as well. So you can see that there in the screen. So you can be doing that kind of thing. A lot of them have a lot more options than that. For example, there's a laughter one, and there's various things. Even Zoom has more, but these 2 basic ones they've made very easily accessible that you can use them at any point in time. So that sort of reaction is another level of engagement. Then there is, of course, using the microphone. So what I often do is I ask people to raise a hand, and if they raise a hand, then I'll say, okay, let's hear from you, and then you, and then you, and then get them to speak. Otherwise, everybody speaks over each other. So you want to have some level of coordination to make sure that you don't have people speaking over each other. But it's good to hear voices, and it's good to not be the only voice in the classroom, in the virtual classroom.
Well, I'd imagine, especially if you're doing training, you want to have that bit of interaction, whereas if you're doing remote speaking or you're doing a short webinar, you probably don't want too many interruptions, and therefore that webinar scenario is a little bit better. But now, you alluded earlier on to storytelling. Now, we're both storytellers, and you mentioned that in a webinar or a video conference or in training, if it's virtual, you need to try and keep those stories to approximately 2 minutes. What are your other tips regarding storytelling?
So you really need to make sure that your story is heading to a point quite quickly. And in fact, I would try and keep them less than 2 minutes. In fact, if you can do 1 minute stories, even better. So I find that often my stories have multiple points, and I maybe will then rather just split them into separate stories. do a story, and then later I can say, remember that story I told? Let me tell you what then happened, and then make it a separate point. So break it and get a level of feedback and interaction in between. Yeah. I've had some phenomenal feedback on a story where I was telling a story about my granddaughter, and I would talk about how children intuitively want to relate and connect. Yeah. And I would tell the story of, well, you know, imagine my granddaughter sitting here on my arm, but I'm having a conversation with somebody over here. Eventually, she'll put her hands up and turn my head because she wants the connection with me, you know. And then I talk about how we all have this need for connection and relatedness. Now, I mean, that's a nice little concise story. Yeah. And it's very visual. People can see it. I saw your reaction now. That kind of reaction I often get to the story. And people, I've even had people tell me afterwards, that story just really got me. That was brilliant. I could feel I was there, you know. And so you want to make it quite visual, be able to use your hands a little bit, and keep it. You've got this limited stage space, you know. You've got to keep it in this stage, and yet make it really come alive.
And what I liked about that particular story is that it's not somebody else's story or something that you read somewhere. It is your own story. And when people are relating to you as the facilitator, I think that they like to hear your stories because it gives them an insight into yourself, and it actually helps to engage them a lot more.
Which brings up the sort of other typical points about storytelling. Be a little bit vulnerable. Talk about some stuff. Don't come across as I've arrived and I'm gonna tell you how to arrive. Come across as I've also been on journeys, and I've also grown, and I think a little bit of vulnerability in a story also increases engagement. I wouldn't suggest we tell stories about things where we are still struggling, you know, like I had a guy get up and give a speech, and the speech was about how to make a fortune out of speaking. And in his speech, he told a story of how he was destitute the previous month and had been put out of his house.
Yeah, which kind of
going,
and which leads me in a sense to this point about storytelling, that if you're going to tell a story, don't, for instance, tell a joke for the sake of the joke. It's got to lend itself to the points that you're trying to make. So you need to be able to tie them back to one or several points, as you said earlier. That's pretty important. Which leads me to this question. What do you believe are the factors that differentiate a mediocre facilitator from a real online master facilitator?
Yeah, there are many, and I love having this conversation with you because you train us to be master facilitators and master presenters. So, yeah, exceptional speakers. So for me, one of them is practice, practice, practice. Be very confident in the tool. So there's something about people feel they can relax if the person who's facilitating is clearly competent and confident in the tools and the use of the environment. I'll give you a simple example. One of the things that took me a while to learn, especially on Adobe Connect, where you've got so many things going on the screen at the same time. I've got my slides, I've got a chat going on over here, I've got people raising their hands to speak, a variety of things going on, is that I constantly scan all of those. And so every time somebody puts a comment or a question into the chat box, I try to comment on every comment. I try to pick it all up. And then people feel really valued. They feel like, wow, he's noticing my little contributions, and that kind of thing. So it's really getting very comfortable, confident, and of course competent on the virtual environment. This is in addition to all of the speaking skills.
Yeah. I know certainly that if I had to ask a question in the chat box, especially when questions have been asked for and then I don't get a response, I think I would feel ignored. So I think it's very important to make sure that either you're scanning or you've got somebody else there scanning it for you to make sure that those things aren't missed. Absolutely critical. So Ian, one.
Maybe just one more thing, Paul, just to interrupt you there, sorry. And I would say your setup. You need for virtual work, you probably noticed my lighting is reasonable. It's not perfect, but I have lighting from 2 different angles, so you don't see a reflection on my glasses. You'll start to see it when I do that, when I'm looking into the light. But in general, you're not going to see reflections. There's good lighting. It's a contrast with the background. I've been playing with backgrounds over the last couple of weeks, and you might notice this one is slightly out of focus, and that's deliberate to give that sort of bokeh or whatever you call it, pop out effect of having this in focus and the other not, but that should be in focus, the logo, you know. So I've been playing with a few of those effects, and I'm not settled on it yet. You know, a lot of people have really good backgrounds in their study environment that they use, and other people have you know, environments where they want to be more inviting into the home, and there's a bit of vulnerability around that, but you don't want a messy, complicated background where people, you know, almost trying to read your bookshelf all the time, or whatever it might be. So you know, the setup is important. Whether you go green screen or not, that's really debatable as to whether that's necessary. But when people have lighting from behind, or they kind of in their webcams like this, or, you know, it's just, you know, get your head towards the top of the picture. People need to be able to see a little bit of your body for body language, this kind of thing. Get your zoom right for all of that, you know, just get that set up right.
Good stuff. And then, Ian, if people want to find out more, they want to get hold of you, how do they do that?
Well, they're most welcome. They can get hold of me on ian@totally-ian.com. That is my my main email address, ian@totally-ian.com. And or morpheusgenius.com is my website, and there's a contact form on there. And very, very willing to chat and engage.
Wonderful. And we are recording this, so if you want to listen to this again, or recommend that somebody else that you know that can get benefit from this listens to it, you'll either find that on my YouTube channel. Ian will also have a recording of that, and he will link it via his website. So just wait a few days, and then that'll be up. So it just remains for me to thank you very much, Ian. This has been fascinating. It really has been. You've had a mixture of quite sophisticated things that you've shared with us, and some real basics that, if we get right, will help us to be able to be involved in or deliver a really outstanding video conference. So Ian, thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed it. You looked like you were too.
I was having a lot of fun. Always do with these. Thanks, Paul.